Right, let's get into it. For millennia, humanity has looked to the heavens and seen, well, a lot of things. Hope, forgiveness, a super convenient excuse for why your team lost the big game. But chief among them is the idea of a loving creator, a celestial parent figure guiding us with a gentle hand. It's a lovely thought, isn't it? Almost as lovely as the idea of a tax system that makes sense. But what if we've been looking at this whole God thing through rose-tinted glasses? What if, when you actually read the user manual, the holy books, the character you find isn't so much a loving father as he is history's most successful and arguably most ruthless dictator? It's a bold question, I know. It's the kind of question that gets you uninvited from your aunt's Christmas dinner, but it's a fair one. When you stack up the actions attributed to God, it's time we put the divine resume under the same scrutiny we'd apply to any other leader claiming absolute power. Alright, let's start with the big one, the Old Testament. If you're looking for examples of a ruler with a short fuse and a flair for dramatic, city-leveling punishments, this is your holy grail. And I mean that literally. Take the story of the Great Flood. According to Genesis, God looked down at humanity, saw that it was wicked, and decided the best course of action was, and I quote, to blot out from the earth the human beings I have created. This wasn't a targeted strike against a few bad apples. This was a full system reboot, wiping out nearly everyone and everything on the planet. Then there are the fan favorites, Sodom and Gomorrah. Here we have two entire cities incinerated with sulfur and fire from the heavens because of their inhabitants' grievous sins. Again, the method of punishment is total and indiscriminate annihilation. There was no trial, no due process, just a rain of fire that wiped them off the map. Forget a strongly worded letter from the UN. This is divine foreign policy at its most brutally efficient. It sets a terrifying precedent. Displease the man upstairs, and your entire community could be turned into a barbecue pit, an iron fist, a pillar of fire, the occasional plague of locusts. These aren't just isolated incidents. The Old Testament is filled with stories of a God who demands unwavering obedience and punishes deviation with terrifying force. From turning Lot's wife into a pillar of salt for simply looking back, to smiting Uzzah for trying to steady the Ark of the Covenant, the message is crystal clear. There is one law, it is absolute, and the penalty for even minor infractions can be instant death. Now before we get too carried away with celestial wrath, let's turn our attention to the earthly competition. Humanity has produced its own impressive roster of despots, and their resumes are chillingly familiar. Take someone like Joseph Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union. Stalin ruled with absolute control, creating a cult of personality that portrayed him as a benevolent, fatherly leader. Behind this facade, he orchestrated the Great Purge, where millions were executed or sent to Gulag labor camps for perceived disloyalty. Then there's Pol Pot, the leader of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. His vision for an agrarian utopia led to one of the most horrific genocides in modern history. His regime was responsible for the deaths of an estimated 2 million people. Let's not forget North Korea's Kim dynasty. For 3 generations, the Kims have ruled with an iron fist, maintaining power through a pervasive system of state surveillance, propaganda, and brutal punishment. The country is essentially a giant prison camp, where the population is forced to worship the ruling family as divine figures. These human dictators, from Stalin to Pol Pot to the Kims, share a common playbook. They demand total loyalty and create a cult of personality. They do not tolerate dissent and punish it with extreme violence. They often engage in collective punishment, holding entire families or communities responsible for the actions of a few. Their goal is absolute control, and their methods are brutal, efficient, and horrifying. So, let's put the two side by side. On one hand you have human dictators, on the other, the God of the Old Testament. Let's start with the demand for absolute loyalty. Stalin demanded citizens worship the state and his image. The Kim dynasty requires North Koreans to treat them as deities. The very first of the 10 Commandments is, "You shall have no other gods before me." This isn't a suggestion, it's a non-negotiable term of service. Throughout the Old Testament, worshiping other gods is treated as the ultimate crime, often punishable by death for the entire community. Both the divine and the human dictator start from the same premise. I am the one and only authority, and you will bow to me, and me alone. Next up, let's talk about collective punishment. When a political dissident was arrested in Stalin's Russia, their entire family was often branded enemies of the people. Now consider the plagues of Egypt again. Pharaoh was the one being stubborn, yet it was the entire Egyptian population, including innocent children, who suffered. Boils, locusts, and ultimately the death of their firstborn. The punishment was not tailored to the offender, it was carpet-bombed across a whole nation. An omniscient God knows your every thought. Jesus in the New Testament elevates this by stating that even thinking about adultery is the same as committing it in your heart. In this framework there is no escape from the authorities' gaze. Now, to be fair, we are nothing if not scrupulously fair, especially when discussing beings who can theoretically turn us into salt. There is a robust defense for God's actions. Theologians and believers would argue that comparing God to a human dictator is like comparing a surgeon to a serial killer just because they both use a knife. The key difference, they say, is motive and moral authority. A human dictator acts out of greed, paranoia, a lust for power. God, on the other hand, is presented as perfectly just, righteous, and omniscient. According to this view, when God wiped out the world with a flood, he wasn't having a temper tantrum. He was performing a necessary, albeit painful, act of purification. It's cosmic surgery, and sometimes amputation is the only option to save the patient. Furthermore, the argument goes that humans simply lack the perspective to judge God's actions. We are finite beings with limited understanding, like ants trying to comprehend the motivations of a human building a highway. What looks like senseless destruction to us might be part of a much larger, incomprehensible divine plan that is ultimately for the greater good. The plagues of Egypt in this light were not acts of terror but carefully calibrated miracles designed to liberate an enslaved people and demonstrate God's power over the false gods of a tyrannical empire. This perspective also posits that God, as the creator of life, has the ultimate right to take it away. Life is a gift from God, not a right that we possess independently. Therefore, when God ends a life or commands it to be ended, he is not committing murder in the human sense. He is simply reclaiming what is his. His justice is absolute because his ownership is absolute. It's a tough pill to swallow, but it's a logically consistent argument within its own theological framework. But the question remains, does logical consistency equal moral acceptability? Of course, it's not just the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob who has a penchant for dramatic displays of power. Let's take a little trip around the world, shall we? In Hinduism, the gods are a complex bunch, but they are certainly not above a bit of divine wrath. Take Shiva. He is known as the Destroyer. This destruction is often framed as part of a necessary cycle of creation, preservation, and destruction. In one story, Shiva famously beheads his own son Ganesha in a fit of rage, before later replacing his head with that of an elephant. While it all works out in the end, it's a stark reminder that even divine beings can act first and ask questions later. Then we have the gods of ancient Greece, a dysfunctional, superpowered family living on a mountain. Zeus, the king of the gods, ruled with thunderbolts and a notoriously short temper. He once punished humanity for receiving the gift of fire by chaining Prometheus to a rock, then having his liver eaten by an eagle for all eternity. Even in Buddhism, often seen as more philosophical, there are powerful, wrathful figures. In Tibetan Buddhism, there are the wrathful deities, terrifying figures with multiple heads, fangs, and garlands of skulls. The theological explanation says their wrath is a fierce expression of compassion, designed to destroy obstacles to enlightenment like ego and ignorance. These examples show the concept of a divine being wielding life or death power is not unique to one religion. The management style is surprisingly consistent across pantheons. They demand worship and punish mortals for slights real and imagined. Whether seen as just, necessary, or capricious, the underlying theme is immense power and the demand for submission. Alright, we've heard the defense. It's not cruelty, it's divine justice. You just don't understand the plan. Consider the story of Job. Here is a man described as blameless and upright. God, in what amounts to a wager with Satan, allows this good man to be subjected to the most horrific suffering imaginable. His children are killed, his wealth is destroyed, he is afflicted with painful sores from head to toe. And for what? To test his loyalty, to prove a point. This isn't justice, it's a cruel and sadistic experiment. Job's friends offer the standard theological defense, you must have sinned. But the story itself makes it clear, he didn't. And what about all the rules that seem arbitrary and come with a death sentence? In the book of Numbers, a man is found gathering wood on the Sabbath. God's verdict is for the entire community to stone the man to death. Stoned to death for picking up sticks. This isn't a proportional response, it's brutal enforcement. Let's return to the conquest of Canaan. The command to utterly destroy entire populations is presented as a divine order. Women, children, infants. Apologists might argue this was to prevent the Israelites from being corrupted by pagan cultures, but this is the logic of ethnic cleansing. It looks less like a holy war, and more like a brutal, divinely sanctioned land grab. To call this justice requires a complete redefinition of the word, twisting it into something unrecognizable. When you strip away the divine authority, what you are left with is a command to commit genocide. It looks less like holy justice and more like brutal statecraft dressed in religious language. Ah, free will. This is the ultimate theological trump card, the ace up the sleeve for any defender of God's actions. The argument goes like this: you are born, make a mistake, anger God, get smited. God gave humans free will, the ability to choose between good and evil. All the suffering in the world, that's not God's fault. It's the result of humans making bad choices. The flood, Sodom and Gomorrah, all those smitings, those were just the necessary consequences for the abuse of free will. If a car manufacturer designs a car with faulty brakes and then says, "I gave you the freedom to drive it however you want," we would hold the manufacturer liable. Is it truly free will if you are created with a known predisposition to sin and placed in a world full of temptation? If a dictator says, "You are free to do whatever you want, but if you criticize me, I will torture your family," is that freedom? The choice between obey me completely and suffer eternal torment doesn't sound like a genuine choice. It sounds like coercion. It's like giving a toddler a loaded gun and then being shocked when something terrible happens. The classic example is the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. The text explicitly says, God hardened Pharaoh's heart so that he would refuse to let the Israelites go. So, Pharaoh wasn't freely choosing to be stubborn, he was being divinely manipulated into it. He was a puppet in a divine play. And his people paid the price. You can't claim to be a champion of free will in one breath, and then admit to using mind control to escalate a conflict in the next. It's a massive contradiction that undermines the entire argument. So where does this all leave us? We've looked at the evidence. We've seen a divine being who demands total obedience, punishes dissent with overwhelming force, and engages in acts of collective punishment. We're left with two very different portraits of the same figure, one of a loving creator, the other of a celestial tyrant. And frankly, the evidence for the latter is uncomfortably strong. The point of this exercise is not to convince you that God is evil. The point is that we should be able to ask the question without being struck by lightning or ostracized by our communities. For centuries, religious authority has been presented as unquestionable. To doubt is a sin. To ask hard questions is a sign of weak faith. But this is the same logic used by every dictator who has ever lived. Do not question me. Do not challenge my authority, just obey. The ability to question authority is the most fundamental principle of a free and thinking society. It is the engine of progress. We questioned the authority of kings and got democracy. We questioned the authority of the church and got the scientific revolution. Every step forward humanity has taken has been because someone dared to ask, wait a second, does this actually make sense? If a being is truly just, and its rules are truly good, then they should be able to withstand our scrutiny. Read the text for yourself. Look at the stories. Examine the rules. Ask the hard questions. Whether you are a person of deep faith, a staunch atheist, or somewhere in between, the challenge remains the same. Questioning authority, even the highest authority of all, is not an act of blasphemy. It is an act of intellectual honesty. It is our right, and perhaps even our most important responsibility. Thank you.